God know the future? Does he know all of it, some of it, or none of it? If God doesn't know the future, what are the implications? Or why does it even matter? Some of these are the questions that I hope will be answered in this video. But before going into some of the questions, let's define foreknowledge. In the Greek scriptures, there is a verb form as well as a noun form of foreknowledge. In the Greek Septuagint, both terms are used to translate the single Hebrew word yada. This is important to recognize, for when it is used of God in relation to His foreknowing human beings, it refers to much more than just intellectual knowledge. In Jeremiah 1:5 it states, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you." Genesis 4:1 states, "Now the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain." Now, according to Jeremiah 1:5, this was a personal knowing. And when Adam knew Eve in Genesis 4:1, the result was the conception of a child. This means that the quote-unquote knowing of Eve by Adam was more than just an intellectual understanding of her existence. Instead, it was intensely personal. So when we speak of God's knowing someone, we're speaking of His entering into a personal relationship with them. In Exodus 33:17, Jehovah speaks of Moses as knowing His name. Now surely God is not just simply saying that He just literally knows His name. Something more personal is in view here. God is indicating His gracious decision to enter into a very special and personal relationship with Moses. The fact that this passage is so prominent in Paul's discussion of election in Romans 9:15 is significant as well. For if Paul connects Exodus 33:19 with God's predestination in Romans 9, then surely his usage of foreknow in Romans chapter 8 is drawn here too. Now much more could be said of the fact that God does not just know actions, but rather people. In other words, God is not this passive recipient of knowledge of future events, but the active one who is foreknowing people. Now this is something that God does when He enters into a personal relationship with His creation. So this concept of having knowledge of future events in the form of the word foreknowledge is simply a non-biblical use of this word. Now this is an important distinction to recognize in light of the fact that God's knowledge of the future is completely dependent upon His sovereign decree rather than some sort of passive intake of intellectual knowledge. And if this isn't first established in this discussion, it's going to be difficult to not only answer the question of, does God know the future, but also, how does God know the future? And because there are differing perspectives on this issue, it will be my task to not only defend the position that God knows the future, but that He also knows it exhaustively. And though it may be of interest to the audience that I am approaching this issue as a Calvinist, the classical theist or Arminian shouldn't find too much, if anything, that they will disagree with. But let me say this up front to those who might object to these ideas. Now, all it would take to disprove the doctrine of omniscience would be to show just one place in Scripture where God didn't know something or where God learned something new. But for the sake of time, I'll address those objections in a future video. Now let's see what the Bible has to say about God's exhaustive knowledge of the future. 1 John 3:20 states, "For God is greater than our heart and knows all things." Now those who deny God's exhaustive foreknowledge may claim that God knows all things. That is, He knows all things past and present. And this is also true in light of the context, for it speaks of our heart condemning us if we only love with our thoughts and words, but not our deeds. And because God knows our hearts better than we do, He will not only know our actions, but our motives as well. But the reason God can know our heart is because He knows all things. And this presents a problem for those who might claim that God is omniscient, yet He doesn't know the future. And the reason being, God is either omniscient or He is not. And if there is anything at all that God doesn't know, then He is not omniscient. And maybe the following example will illustrate my point. Now, some believe that God didn't know that Adam and Eve would sin. And if this were the case, then God would have reacted in such a way to say to Himself, "I didn't know that would happen." And if God can be attributed with an "I don't know" statement, then by definition, He is not all-knowing. Now let me explain this a different way. Because God is the uncaused cause of all things, He exists in a pure state of actuality. Now as humans, we're created with the potential to learn, grow, and change. And when we learn new things, we move from this state of potentiality to a state of actuality. And this can be likened to a pile of bricks that are comprised with both actuality and potentiality, since they have the potential to actually become a building. Now God, on the other hand, He is pure existence with no potential to be actualized. And unlike things within a time-bound creation, God is uncaused and therefore must exist with no potential to be anything other than what He is. But according to those who would deny God's exhaustive knowledge of the future, God does not know all things. In fact, He comes to learn new things all the time. And this brings God down to the level of humans, who takes in knowledge sequentially, one thing after another. But this cannot be the case with God if He is self-existent and an eternal being, because by nature, He would have to know all things eternally at the same time. Therefore, He only knows according to His mode of existence. Now, He is not a being who has anything. He just simply is. So that whatever God has, He actually is according to His nature. So what's the inevitable conclusion of all this? Since God is an eternal, unchanging, infinite being, He must know all things in an eternal, unchanging, and infinite way. And that's why John 3:20 must be interpreted in light of the context of the uncaused, eternal creator of the universe.